Welcome everybody once again. I'm excited to have Andy Broadbent join us today as part of the outdoor photo series. For everybody that's seeing it for the first time, let me just real quick show you that all of our episodes, in addition to being live, so we encourage everybody to ask questions. You can also join us at outex.com, where you can go to our community page and click on Outdoor Photo Series. And all of the episodes are recorded there as well, so that you can ask questions, even if not live, and we'll try to answer them there as well. As with many of our guests, Andy is a multi-talented professional photographer and is, I think, just as comfortable in the studio as he is outside of the studio. But we're going to talk about all things photography and maybe focus on some fashion photography. So Andy, welcome and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's good to speak to you.
Let me start with a little bit of a historical background for people joining us. How did you end up where you are today? You know, what got you into photography? And then I know you've done a lot of different types of photography, but then what led you to fashion photography and portraiture photography and to kind of where you are today?
Yeah, my start was from college, I suppose. I went to college. After that, I worked for a company that was pre-press post-production. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't really photography, but it was a lot of retouching and making things ready for print. So I was in that for a lot of years, and then I went freelance around 2010, and I was still doing predominantly post-production and graphics layout work. At that time, I bought myself my first camera, as it was quite closely aligned to what I was doing already, and proceeded then to self-teach the photography side of things. I wanted to pretty much give a full service so I could be able to do production and post-production. And so that was my sort of employment history, if you like. And for the styles of things I do now, I'm not sure it was a purposeful path to what I'm doing now. It was just, I think I started off, when I first started doing photography, I really liked all the really heavily post-produced stuff, you know, the kind of things you'd see in Hollywood posters, a lot of composites and things like that, whereas after a while I sort of progressed and wanted to go a bit more natural, and fashion kind of things just grabbed my fancy after that.
Yeah.
And kind of that's where I am now.
Okay. And so you started your work in post-production, right? Before you kind of got more behind the camera.
Yeah, and I still do a lot of that as well, to be honest with you. As I say, I work freelance, so the business I've got is multifaceted, and a lot of clients that I work with, they'll ask for one thing or the other, so I'll still work with a lot of marketing agencies who'll book me to do graphics layout or retouching work, of where they might book me to do each one of those things. You know, they know I've got the skill set to do each of those things, so they'll maybe get me in 1 week to do one thing and another week to do another thing.
I know a lot of people love to talk about gear, so let's talk about that for a bit.
Okay.
When you started, your career, what kind of cameras and lenses and lighting and other gear were you using? And then talk us through maybe some of that evolution to today and what you're excited about in terms of gear, technology, cameras and lenses.
Yeah. So the first camera I got was a Canon 7D. At the time I didn't know really that much about the camera side of things. So I asked a few people, and obviously there's the whole Canon and Nikon debate. So a lot of people had their opinions and preferences on which brand to go for. And the reason I got the 7D initially was I saw a really good deal online, which was about 90% off. I ordered the camera, did a bit of research, found out that it was a really capable camera, and then the order got cancelled because obviously it must have been a mistake. So, but in the meantime, I had done research on the camera and it seemed really good anyway, so I just reordered it at the full retail price. So I had that 7D for probably 3 or 4 years. That's normally the cycle I have for cameras. So I had the Canon 7D and then progressed onto the Canon 5D Mark III. Then the 5D Mark IV, which I had up until December of last year. And at present now, I've got the Canon EOS R, they're at the moment top of the range mirrorless camera, because I wanted to progress into that, because I just saw that I think that's the way the market and the industry will progress. So I thought I may as well be a relatively early adopter on that side of things.
How did you feel as a fashion photographer? How did you feel about the transition between DSLR and mirrorless? Was that a big deal or not for you?
Not massively. It's relatively seamless. Obviously, I've continued within the same brand, so there's lots of familiarities between the cameras. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there is new technology in there that you need to get used to, but it's not a massive learning curve, I don't think. And I think that Canon will bring out a better version of this camera later on this year, so I might even upgrade to that one.
The EOS R5?
Yes.
Yeah, there's been a lot of buzz about that camera. The specs have been announced. It seems like for a while, Nikon and Canon had taken a back seat on the development side. Sony had done a lot of advancements, but it does appear that with the R5, Canon has sort of said, "Hey, we're back."
Yeah, I mean, I try not to get too hooked into the new gadgets, although I do like a new gadget. But yeah, it does seem as though with this camera, it's their sort of response to try and get ahead of the market again. Most of the specs, I think they've released some specs for the camera, but it's mainly the video specs that they've released so far. I don't
leaning on the video side as far as where they are gearing this positioning.
Yeah, I think, even for video shooters, I think some of it might be a little bit of overkill. They've got the 8K video in there, which even video shooters probably won't be using, or at least, they might use it a little bit. But I think these headline specs sell cameras, so people see that headline of 8K video and rush to buy it. I think the thing when you're buying a new camera, I prepare to have them for 3 or 4 years anyway. So even if it's a little bit of overkill now, within that 3 or 4 years, it might have sort of grown, the industry might have caught up with it a little bit, so those features might come more useful a year in the future.
Right. I think the other thing that some people don't realize when these specs come out is that it also impacts your entire workflow, right?
Yeah, most definitely.
Everything from card storage to permanent storage to the actual editing workflow, the organization of your images and your content, especially when you're talking about video, you're talking about terabytes.
Yeah, that is the thing when you upgrade a lot. It's the whole ecosystem. I bought a Sigma 85mm art lens when they got first released, and that forced me to do a little bit of extra work, really, because the lens is so super sharp that when you're doing portrait or beauty work, every piece of hair, all the peach fuzz hair, that's razor sharp when you use a lens like that. So when you get into the editing side of things, it might take you a little bit longer. So sometimes it's not always desirable to have the most advanced piece of equipment, because sometimes it can cause you headaches.
And do you find that the publishing of the work has also changed? In other words, it makes a difference if you're going to be digital publishing images, right? For things like social media, which a lot of brands these days, whether it's fashion, lingerie, fragrances, you name it, there's a lot of movement towards digital versus large billboards, printing and all that. So do you find yourself using different cameras for that, or do you do most of that in post?
No, I pretty much use the same camera for everything. I tend to like, as I say, I've got the EOS R at the moment, which is a 30 megapixel camera. So even if I know the output is going to be small and digital, I'll often edit the image. I'll shoot and edit the images in the largest size.
Okay.
Just in case in future they do want it for print or magazine, and then you output it for whatever device it's going to go on. Okay.
How about lenses? I guess one advantage of having stuck with the same brand is that there's more compatibility of the lenses without having to use many adapters and that. How has that evolved for you, and how do you choose which lens to use on different jobs? What's your thought process for people wondering about lens selection?
Most of I've got 3 lenses that I use most often. What they are is I have a Canon 70-200 IS 2. So that, I would say, is the main workhorse lens I've got. I can, if I was struggling for space in my bag or traveling for a distance and you only had a certain amount of carry-on, so I could only carry one lens, that would probably be the lens that I'd take with me. But to complement that, I've got a Tamron 24-70.
75, I have that one.
Yeah, I think it's G2. So that I often, if I'm just doing a bit of a location scout or a recce or for personal kind of stuff, so if I was just going on holiday, I'll often take that because it's quite a versatile lens, because it can go from quite wide to a medium telephoto. And also for you guys as well, it's the one I use if I'm doing any of the underwater stuff, because it's what I've got the filters for the Outex gear. And the third main one is the Sigma 85mm 1.4 arts lens. So for the three lenses, the 85mm, if I'm doing portrait work or beauty work, that's really good for that. Although I can still use the 24 to 7, the 70 to 200 for it. And the 70 to 200, it covers all sorts. So probably 50% of the stuff you show in there on my website and Instagram is easily done by that. And then the 24 to 70, anything underwater, anything when I'm on a personal holiday, a bit of a recce, or I don't do a lot of landscape kind of things, but if I needed something with that width, I'd go for the 24 to 70.
Okay.
So generally, if I'm going out on a job, I'll have one or two of those lenses in my bag, because obviously there's always, you know, there can always be a time when one of something fails on you. So maybe a lens fails, or you could get damaged, or so it's always good to have another lens in your bag, because at least then you can complete the job, even if it's not exactly as you'd liked it.
Do you have photographers that historically have inspired you? You know, do you have mentors or people that you looked for inspiration as you were moving throughout your career? And do you consider yourself to have a style? And it's an interesting, I ask a lot of our guests that question, and it's funny, the range of answers that I get.
Yeah.
I'm genuinely interested in the answer, as opposed to whether there is an answer, but how you think of
it. Initially, when I first picked up a camera, as I say, I was quite into the really heavily processed stuff back then. Uh-huh. So back then there's a chap called Michael Muller, who's American. I think he's LA based, and he does a lot of the Marvel movies. He does all the poster work for all of those movies. Uh-huh. So initially I was influenced by that, and that's why earlier in my career, or earlier in my photography life, I used more lights for things, whereas as I progressed, I probably used less strobes and flashes. So back then I'd maybe have 3-point lights, so you know, you'd get that really edgy look. And so I think he was an influence early on, but that, although, you know, he's still obviously a fantastic photographer and nothing's changed with him, my preferences changed a little bit. So I'm trying to think. Now I quite like a lot of these Annie Leibovitz, obviously, you know, these the big names, because I think with her stuff, what I like is that even when she's using strobes and artificial light, it still looks as though it's shot in natural light, or that it's shot with the available light. So she'll very skillfully mix the light in a situation so as it doesn't draw attention to itself.
Okay.
And along that lines, you've got David Bellamy as well. You know, he's really good with how he masters light and uses what seems to be, looks like he uses filters and shoots through glass to get, you know, strange effects. So, and there's a lot of people who I still look at the work, but I'm not sure if it's influenced my execution of images, because I love, there's a guy called Vincent Peters who I love his work. It looks very sort of old Hollywood, you know, a lot of dramatic black and whites. Which,
do you consider yourself to have a style? Are there particular things that you would say are unique about your method that you've developed over time? And forgive me, because from my perspective, I deal with a lot of different types of photographers that are doing everything from canyoning, caving, surfing. And so it's not all fashion portraiture. And so it's genuine from a lot of our audience in wanting to understand the nuances and even the lens selection for a fashion shoot, for example, because there may be a difference in getting in on the action with a surf shot or a sports shot versus the comfort level with the model, the setting within the model, the story that you're trying to capture with the fashion shoot, where it's more than just, the dress, but the setting. And so I was wondering about your artistic choices and how you define your style based on the lessons you've learned.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, I remember asking someone actually a couple of years ago, and because I said I didn't think I had a particular style, and that person said, "Oh no, I can definitely tell when I see an image, even before I've seen the tag in it, I know that it's yours." So, and still at the time, I couldn't really put my finger on it. I think generally the thought process I've got whenever I'm doing a shoot is I like everything to sort of make sense, if you like. So, the story to make sense, the outfit and the lighting to complement the scene. Sometimes I find with models that they might, with the pose, sometimes the posing won't really match the story. So I often have to simplify things. I like things to be generally quite simple and elegant. If you, I see obviously scrolling through the images there. I like a lot of backlit images. That's something I didn't. It wasn't a conscious thing that I necessarily go through, but I remember looking through my body of work a while ago and noticing that I had a lot of backlit work in there. So I think that's it. Simplicity is something I aim for, and just sort of elegance and for everything to make sense.
Okay. What advice do you have for people that want to get into fashion photography? That with the benefit of your hindsight, what advice would you have for them?
Definitely get into it for the right reasons. If you've got an actual passion for it, because it can be a frustrating thing to get into. There's a lot of, even if you're quite artistic, there's a lot of hustle involved. You've got to pitch to clients, you've got to pick up the phone to ring clients. There's lots of work on the back end where you're backing up images, editing images, liaising on shoots. So it's not all, there's a beach shot there. It's not all being on beaches with pretty people and playing in the surf. There's a lot of hard work involved. So I'd say just obviously be prepared for the slog, and just always be open to improvement and criticism. Sometimes you can get a little bit attached to your work, and sometimes you don't necessarily see the flaws yourself because you've been involved in the process. So try and be quite objective on your images and not get too disheartened if people don't agree with you. But still stick to your core principles. People might say to you that your style isn't relevant or isn't required at the minute, but if you firmly believe in the stuff that you're doing, continue, but just try and try and get better at it.
Are there stories that you can share with us about a shoot where you encountered unforeseen situations, and some examples of some of that perspiration that goes behind the inspiration?
Most of the time things go relatively smoothly. I've certainly had occasions where if you're quickly swapping from one location to another, like I was in Miami at the end of 2018, and we went quickly from the street to the beach, and it had been raining, and the day was quite a lot cooler, and we went from sort of one temperature to another, so the lens I was using just all fogged up on the inside of the lens. So until that, well, I had to just, that's why I said before, I tend to always carry a couple of lenses, so the other lens I hadn't fogged up, so I had to change that lens over for the other one. That's why it's always a good idea to have two lenses. That also happened to me the only time I've ever done a wedding. I did a wedding once and the same thing happened to me, so that quick change in temperature can affect your lenses. And generally I've always been able to get round things one way or another. The things that go wrong for me are generally something to do with if I'm using strobe lights. So sometimes if the trigger isn't working, or there's some sort of compatibility issue. But again, that's the other thing I'd say about advice to people getting in photography. Troubleshooting is part of it as well. I tend to carry a speed light with me. Not that I rarely use speed lights for the purpose they're used for, but if I do have problems with remote controls for strobes, you can often set the strobe light to an optical slave and use your speed light to trigger it. So that's why I often carry a speed light with me. And then if all else fails lighting wise, become good at shooting in natural light. Okay. You know, it's that's one thing that I got sort of the wrong way around when I first got into photography. I really wanted to pick up the knowledge of how to use flashlights and speed lights, whereas I think you're better off just learning the full capabilities of your camera and getting good with natural light. So
do you find that there are some lessons that you can share with people, especially given the focus of our series, on the main differences between studio work for the work that you do, fashion, portraiture, etc., and outdoor work where you are obviously dealing with completely different lighting? Major lessons or advice that you would have for photographers that may have cut their teeth in the studio but want to do more outside, outdoor type photography?
Yeah, with that, the thing that took me a little bit of time to get used to working outdoors, certainly anywhere in a public area, is you've got to get over any sort of shyness or embarrassment that because people will often come over and interrupt you, and people are stopping to stop and stare. So you've got to just block that out. You know, I've often on outdoor shoots, I'll get people coming up to me or trying to speak to the model, you know, ask it, what's this for? Are you famous? You know, am I going to see this in a magazine? Where can I look out for it? I've had people ask the model for an autograph, even though the model isn't particularly high profile. I think they're just taking the chances just in case.
Looking for their number, maybe?
Well, also, yeah, I was in, at the end of 2018, before I went to Miami, I was in LA, and there was a guy there who tried to hijack my shoot. He said it was his last day in LA. He'd been unable to get a model. So he's like, oh, can I borrow your model? Well, no, not really.
No.
Yeah. So yeah, it's strange the requests you'll get. And as for the sort of technical sides of it, again, if you're used to working in studio under a totally controlled light system, learn how to mix light. So, you know, so obviously you can go out, and if you've got the perfect day, you can perhaps use the natural light as it stands without too much modification. But there'll often be days when the light outside is quite tricky, so you might have to supplement it with either a big reflector or a light on low power. So as it again, a big thing with me is I don't like drawing attention to the actual use of studio lights outdoors. So I'll often just put them on a low power, just as a bit of a fill flash. So yeah, I'd certainly get adept with that mixing of the light, and then it's a little bit of troubleshooting, because when you're outdoors, the lighting can change like that. You know, you can be bright sunshine 1 minute, then it'll go behind the clouds. So you've got to kind of roll with punches and have a second plan in your head. So if you're looking for the really contrasty, punchy lights, razor sharp shadows in your shots, and then it goes cloudy, instead of panicking and stopping and hoping that you get the light again, it's like, we'll just do another set of softer light. You know, we'll go, so for instance, if you're on the beach, you go maybe just to the edge of the beach, if there's some rocks or something like that, and get a bit of a softer look, even if that's not the actual brief, and just wait it out until the sun comes back out, and get back to the original plan.
How often, as a commercial photographer, do you have to adapt? Because I imagine that a lot of the work requires, you know, scouting, planning, you think through the locations. I'm assuming that you're working with a staff of knowns and models that you've worked with before. And so how often do you have to improvise, or do you have a brief that calls for a location that maybe you don't have a lot of time or a lot of access to, that you have to sort of make it work quickly? Is that common, and are there many examples of that?
Yeah, very common. You know, as soon as you step out of the studio, you're open to the elements. So even if you've sufficiently scouted the area you're at, as I say, the weather can change, or there can be all sorts of outside influences that can trip you up. So it's always good to have a plan B in your head. I'll often, even if the client has got, if they've supplied a brief and the location, a mood board of my own in the bank as well, just in case something goes wrong or doesn't quite go to plan. You've often got to think on your feet. I think there was a shoot I did in South Africa last year, So with that one, there was literally no preparation for it. So I'd spoken to the client before, but we had never actually worked together as such. They noticed that I was in South Africa, and they had some of their products there. It was an apparel, sporting apparel. So they contacted me and said, "We've got some gear over there. Can you shoot a bit of a mini campaign for us?" So literally in the space of a couple of hours, I had to speak to a model, pick up the gear from, it was an assistant they had over there, do a bit of a mini location scout, shoot the stuff and get it back to the client. So yeah, you don't always have a brief from the client, and sometimes you do have to deviate as well because of the conditions.
Okay. Something else that comes up often, given the types of photographers that we talk to that are shooting in adverse conditions and sometimes weird environments, is the adaptness of the model to the conditions, right? So if you're talking about underwater, it takes a special kind of model. Sometimes you're talking about rain or cold, and dealing with the cold, dealing with wind, or being on the beach and getting the waves crashing. How often do you work with models that you have to coach through? How much variability is there in some of the work that you do, and what's your experience or advice for people that are working with an agency or with a model in general and want to prep so that they're not encountering an adverse situation in the shoot?
Yeah, I mean, generally, most of the time the casting of the model is done by the client. So, I've not always got an input into that in advance. So, often for that side of things, you've not got much control over it. So then it's just a matter of you've got to work with them and get what you need to get. So that same trip in South Africa last year, I remember as quite a good example of sometimes the problems you can face. I had two models that I was shooting. One was a really fair-haired model with fine blonde hair, and the other model was of Greek descent. She had really thick, dark hair, and it was a super windy day. So a lot of the time I had to focus more on the dark-haired model because her hair wasn't getting blown all over the place. Whereas the blonde model, hers was really out of control. So if you've got good makeup and hair on set, that's obviously always a good thing. So you can then liaise with the hair artist and ask them to, as long as it doesn't contravene the brief, you can ask them maybe to tie the hair, or obviously spray. You can put some product in it to control it a little bit better. Or and in that instance where I was on a beach, maybe even wet the hair, because obviously, like I said before, I like things to make sense in the shot. So a bit of wet hair on a beach, it makes sense, and obviously then it'll help. So you've just got to sort of figure out which way to go in that situation. And then for actual coaching, is hair and makeup also something that the client usually indicates, or is that something that your team brings to the table? Normally, I mean, so sometimes they'll ask for recommendations, and obviously I've been working at it this long. These quite a lot of makeup and hair artists that I'd be confident enough to recommend on shoots. So So yeah, I can always make the recommendations, and if the client does say to me, yeah, we want you to cast it, so often that can happen with smaller, few and far between, and it's something that they've just not got a lot of experience in producing. So they might say to you, yeah, we want you to shoot this, but can you also cast the model, recommend a makeup artist, and can you build the team and bring the team along with you. Generally with bigger clients, they'll or in my experience, they'll often do that themselves.
Okay, brilliant. Are there questions that I should have asked about your craft that you wanted to address? Because there's so much about this stuff that I don't know, and I'm wondering what I've missed or what advice you have for aspiring photographers that they should think about as they're getting into the business.
Well, you did kind of touch on it before when you were asking for sort of advice for people getting into the industry, and I didn't put this into it at the time, but I'd certainly, I'm a little bit biased when I say this because I've come from a post-production pre-press background, but I'd certainly advise any photographer, whether they're a beginner or intermediate or even even good photographers, if they've got no knowledge of Photoshop and editing, I'd at least learn how to get by, just to do basic edits, because it does, good editing can take an average image to an amazing image, and even if it's just, say you've got a retoucher who you always hand your work off to, so you're quite confident with them for that. Sometimes it's good to know a little bit yourself, so you could maybe do a workup of how you want the images, do that as an example on one of the images, send it to them as an example and say, oh, can you follow that guide and do them in a similar style, but obviously better, because that's your forte. So I'd definitely say learn some Photoshop. That'd definitely be one piece of advice, and one thing that I hadn't mentioned before as such. But again, that's probably a little bit of bias from mine, because I still see it as quite an art form, and it can be undervalued, because a lot of clients nowadays will kind of book you on a shoot and just kind of presume that editing is involved, that is included in the shoot. Mm-hmm. So learn how to bargain with them for that as well, because a lot of clients will say you'll give them your rate or whatever it is for the shoot. You'll agree what it's going to cost them, and a lot of people will just instantly presume or try and get you to agree to throw in the editing, whereas it can take up a lot of your time, so it's something that you shouldn't give away for free. Okay.
And so we're getting some questions from the audience, and I want to encourage others, so if you guys have questions, feel free to ask them. And one of the questions, Andy, is related to the retouching we're talking about.
Yeah.
How much does the retouching play a part in your body of work? In other words, as you mentioned, not everybody wants to pay for it or assumes it. So how much of that is a part of your body of work? And then what's the rest? Do you prefer to keep it simple and natural to match your photography style?
Yes. Yeah. With the editing side of things, I'd say 95% of the shots that I shoot, I'll edit in some way, but I always shoot in a way so as I'm giving myself the so I'm not having to do a lot of editing on the back end, basically. So I'll always try and get the shot as close as possible on set, even though that I know what I can do at the back end. And sometimes there can be a, you could be tempted to be lazy, on set. So sometimes if there's a label showing on some apparel, and in the back of your head you might think, I can sort that out in Photoshop. But if the client is editing, or you are editing 20 images from that set and they've all got the label showing, it would have been a lot easier to just tuck it in. It would have taken you 2 seconds on set, and it's going to take you however long on the back end. And as I think part of that question might have also been sort of hinting at, do my original images bear a lot of resemblance to the end product? So am I editing heavily, or is it a light hand that I use? So yeah, it tends to be, I try and keep everything really sort of quite, if you just stop on that image that you've got there, that's going to disagree with what I say a little bit. So normally I like to just give myself an easy life in the editing side of things. So I'll try and get everything right on set. That shot in particular was one where I kind of did rely on the retouching skill quite a lot, but I knew that as I was shooting it. Basically, we were at a beach in LA, and we were really running out of light. Obviously you can see that it's close to sunset there.
Yep.
And it was just myself, the model, and a makeup artist, and that was up on some rocks. So we left the makeup artist down on the beach, so we didn't have anyone to hold even a reflector. So what I did with that shot, because we still wanted to retain a realistic sunset, is I shot that about 2 stops underexposed, knowing that I could really pull a lot of detail out in the raw file. And explain that to the model as well. I said to her, look, you've got to trust me on this one. I'm going to shoot it super dark, but it's just so as I can keep that sunset in the background. And I said I can really pull up the brightness in Lightroom or Capture One, and then obviously refine it in Photoshop. So for the most part, I try and get it right as it is. Whether even if that includes bringing in extra lights or reflectors. But with that one, because of the circumstances on the day, I just shot it underexposed and was confident that I could recover it. But I also bracketed the shot as well, so I did one that was perfectly exposed as well. So I could show the model and say, look, there's one that's got the right exposure here, but I've got one, I've got some versions for the sky as well, in case we need to either blend 2 images together or pull, edit that and pull out the detail in the raw converter. Okay.
And as all good things must come to an end, we're going to run out of time soon, but I did want to ask you one final question, which is about the deliverables. Does it happen often that you share, let's say, most of the images with the client? I assume that you do some selection.
Yeah.
And kind of walk us through the selection process. And then does it happen often that the client ends up choosing images that you did not think they were going to pick? Like you give them 10 shots and you think for sure these 4 are going to be the top 4. And they end up going with the ones that you thought were not the top 4.
Yeah, 100%. So generally my process at the end of a shoot, it's pretty consistent depending on the kind of shoot I do. So if it's a model test, a model portfolio, a client job, I pretty much do the same thing. I come home, get the images onto the computer as soon as possible because I'm paranoid about backups. So I get it onto the computer straight away, get it into Capture One, that's the program that I usually use. And then I go through and do a quick cull of, I get rid of all the images that, if you're using Flash, the Flash hasn't fired. If
right.
it's if you've not nailed the autofocus, anything like that, the model eyes are closed, you've got a makeup artist's hand coming into the frame. So all of the unusable ones I delete straight away. And then from that, I tend to make my selections, even if the final choice is going to go to the client or the model, I'll make my selections, and then I give them the option of either seeing everything from the shoot, apart from the ones that I've deleted because they're unusable, or do they want to see my sort of mini selection, and then they choose theirs from that selection. Generally, they choose that. So generally, I might send to the client or the model maybe 100 images, and then they choose their 5, 10, 15, 20 images out of that bunch. Sometimes, shouldn't give my secrets away, but sometimes I might do it. If I've got a particular favourite, I might tweak it a little bit before I send it to them. Mm-hmm. To maybe influence them to
stack the deck in your favor.
Yeah, a little bit. So I've totally given my secret away there. So, but as you sort of intimated, probably at least 60 or 70% of the time, the client or the customer tends to choose ones that that weren't my favourites. That I think would have been the second rung, if you like, the standout ones that I really liked. Often they don't use them, but that can be for any number of reasons. Certainly, if you're working with a model directly on a portfolio or something like that, that's often the time as well, because they're not looking at the image objectively, they're looking at however they see themselves. So if there's something that they're not as confident about, if it doesn't look as good in that picture, they're personally invested, whereas I'm looking at light, exposure, mood.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so you're generally looking at different things, you see.
It's been so much fun. Time flies.
Yeah, it's gone fast. It's gone really fast.
Thank you so much for joining us. I certainly learned a great deal, and as I mentioned, we've recorded this, so we will post it as part of our outdoor series. So if people didn't get their questions answered, they can go to broadbent.com and also find you on Instagram. I'll post the links on our feed, and people can also post questions there or reach out, and we'll make sure that those get answered.